In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
Good morning. Welcome to the Terror of Demons morning show, where we talk about reclaiming traditional Catholic masculinity. I'm joined as always by my co-host and brother, Kennedy Hall. How you doing, brother?
I'm good. How are you? I'm very good.
I'm doing very good, except I've got a little cold.
Can't have that today.
Which I hate to admit, but for the viewers, we have erected a plexiglass screen between my studio in the Midwest of the United States and his studio in Ontario.
We actually put it on the Lake Huron. It's
yes, we can never be too careful.
Yeah,
we definitely want to slow the spread. So,
2 weeks.
Welcome to the 21st week after Pentecost. This week is the Feast of Christ the King. So today's topic is Jesus is King.
That's
We're
right.
talking about the principles of Catholic politics
Mhm.
and what the church teaches on these things, and how to distinguish between what the church teaches and our personal views, and the limits and extent of this, and some of the modern errors afflicting the church today. We also have today is the Feast of Apostles, Saint Simon and Jude.
Mm-hmm.
Pray for us. And of course, we have the great Feast of All Saints and All Souls coming up very soon. So we have one of the Sundays. This Sunday will be All Saints this Sunday. So a great time of year, in especially at least in the northern hemisphere. It's at least in the temperate climate where we're at. All the leaves are changing. Have you lost all your leaves at this point, Kennedy?
Most of them. I've already raked like 40 bags. We got We have 3 big trees, and it's the first year that my boys, they're 5 and 4 years old now. They're actually quite helpful. So I did a lot less. I did all the raking, but I did a lot less stuffing of the leaves in bags, which was great. So probably got about 20 bags or so. I got a tree that falls about 2 weeks after the other trees. So in a week or two, I'll have to do about 20 more bags, I bet.
So you must win against Michigan then, because you really are Canada, because you're further into the winter season than we are in Michigan. So
I guess. I mean,
we've lost about half our leaves where we're at.
Oh, okay. Like, I'm in southwestern Ontario, so I mean, there's parts of Michigan that are like Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, right? It's across from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Same name,
yes,
different
very,
country.
very north. Yeah,
but that's more north than me. So they would, parts of the Midwest are more north than me. But the jet stream, if you watch the border of Canada, it's basically the jet stream, like the jet stream, like that. It's a weather system. It comes down probably like 300-400 miles under the Canadian border, and basically goes like this, and then dips down around southwestern Ontario. I believe that's why we have the borders, because you were like, take it. We don't want that part anyway. So we get pretty cold considering how south we are relative to the other parts of the Midwest.
Excellent. So the what we're going to do is the basic principle of Jesus is King. This is an example of what we talked about yesterday on the show, actually, the ordinary and universal magisterium, what has been believed by all, everywhere, from all time.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at every single, from the east to the west and north to the south, every single instantiation of Christian society after the days of the persecutions, which the era of Christendom we could call beginning often with Constantine, but it actually begins with Armenia in 301. Armenia gets converted, it becomes a Christian nation. But everywhere you go, this is the same principle that gets instantiated. And the principle that I'm going to read from is the Josias, which is what they call integralism in 3 sentences. And I'm not sure where the term integralism came from. It's sort of a new term. I was wondering if it even came from the one of the first paragraphs of Dignitatis Humanae.
Right.
The first paragraph says, "We leave integral the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church regarding the duties of the society to the true church." The term integral is in the Latin. So I don't know if that's where it came from, but do you know where integralism came from, the term?
No, I don't. But I know in moral theology, I mean, you hear people talk about the integral good, like it's basically the idea that an end can't justify the means, sort of thing. Like it's the opposite of our consequentialist ethics. So, I mean, that's why can I watch a movie where there is, I don't know, something objectively scandalous and causes great sin or something, but it's a good movie? It's like, well, you can't, because it's against the integral good, like it's been corrupted, that sort of thing. I don't know. It's a little more complicated.
Yeah, that goes straight into the idea of violent, bloody revolution to achieve a political revolution, which we'll talk about.
Yeah. So integralism gets a bad rap, though. I mean, because we'll talk about how it doesn't have to necessarily be monarchy, even though that's obviously historically been a pretty Catholic form of government. But it's just about, as you'll say, it's just about everything being good in all aspects in a society directed towards the spiritual health of the populace.
Yeah, the essential aspect of it, that I mean, the way that I would break it down before we read this definition, is that society is made up of the king, the coin, and the kitchen, which is the king meaning the government, the coin meaning the economy, and the way that interactions are happening in the economy, and then the kitchen meaning the family. So really all of society interacting, and the way that society is built with the government and with, it's really just a family of families is what any government or state or nation is. And the idea that Jesus is king is simply that he is king over it all. There's no aspect of it where he is not king, and he should not be sovereign through the mediation of the church, and because Christ mediates his authority through the church. So therefore the church should not be some authority over all, even though there are limits to the competency of the church in given areas, which we'll talk about, like the area of physical science or physics or something like that, even though there are aspects of that. But this is the definition given by the Josias. I think this is right on point. And notice what it says about monarchy. Nothing. So here's what it says. Integralism in 3 sentences. Catholic integralism is a tradition of thought that, rejecting the liberal separation of politics from concern with the end of human life, holds that political rule must order man to his final end. So already in the first sentence, we see the very first error of liberalism, which is the separation of politics from concern with the end of human life. So, which gets into the error of separation of church and state, which we'll talk about. So continuing on, second sentence. Since, however, man has both a temporal and an eternal end, integralism holds that there are 2 powers that rule him, a temporal power and a spiritual power. Okay, so man has a natural end, natural happiness, meaning, his what many of the right liberal school call human flourishing, which is simply having your daily bread, having your home, that type of thing, natural happiness, all your necessities in this life, so that you can pursue then your supernatural end, which is the salvation of your soul. So you need to have both. You can't just reject one of those. You need both of those things. So then, so you have these 2 different ends. You've got the temporal end and the eternal end. And then the final sentence is that since man's temporal end is subordinated to his eternal end, the temporal power must be subordinated to the spiritual power. Now, this is the scary sentence for many liberals, because they think that Christians are trying to overthrow the state and impose a Christian government and force everyone to go to mass and reinstate the Inquisition and all that type of thing. So, excuse me. So, an important error, and that Leo XIII talks about, is that, and we've talked about on the show, is the norm of obedience to civil authority, even pagan authority. We're not trying to overthrow the government with violence. That's not the way of the Christian.
No.
There's also a lot of misconceptions about the Christian societies of the past, and not without reason too, because I think their kings have always attempted to use the church for their own power, and this has been happening since day one, since 301, because the kings let in the Christian church. They promote the Christian church, but then they realize that the Christian church is going to stop them from, cheating on their wife. And so then they're like, whoa, wait a second. I let the Christian church in, but now the Christian church is messing with my power. So now they want to switch it around, and the king wants to use the church for his own power and use it as somehow, forcing people to be baptized and that type of thing. The church has always condemned that. But that type of abuse has always existed anytime the church has mingled with the state power. And so there are these abuses, but the church condemns the abuse of state power.
Yep.
So, but the biggest error here is the separation of church and state. Now, what are your thoughts on Kennedy? Would you say that's really the biggest error?
The separation of church and state?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Even before I was a traditional Catholic, whatever that means, I never understood the separation of church and state, because I thought, how could you be a Catholic and make decisions as a Catholic, but then not be Catholic when you're leading things? I mean, it's like in your life, I don't care if you're at the grocery store. I mean, if it's Friday and you're picking up something for lunch, you're just not going to buy something that has meat in it. You know what I mean? Like, you just make a decision based on your moral principles and the teachings of the church. You can't stop doing that when you go into work. I mean, we'll maybe talk about this. There's certain things you can tolerate. There's toleration, like, so for example, Aquinas talks about various evils that are already, not that you promote, but that are already existing within your society that you could tolerate, because it's sort of one of those things where you go, well, human nature being what it is, people are going to do X, Y, and Z. And it's already happening. So let's regulate it. Let's tolerate it. Let's put it to a corner of the city so we can eventually get rid of it, sort of thing. So you might do that in your society, but not in your home. I'm not going to tolerate certain things in my own personal home, but I could on the society as a whole. But I mean, that's really the only way you can kind of, quote unquote, you're not even really separating, you're just sort of tolerating. But yeah, separating church and state. Jesus is king. I mean, you can't separate the king from his creation. It doesn't really make any sense. That's just the basic way I understand it.
Yeah, the idea is that Jesus is king, and we think of the rights of Christ the King.
Yep.
Everybody's talking about the rights of man, but what about the rights of Christ the King? It is his right to be worshipped by the society. And Vatican II even says that, like we said.
Which is
society
ironic.
has an obligation. The term they use is obligation. The society has an obligation to the true religion. God has the right to be worshipped by the state.
First commandment.
Jesus the king.
The first 3 commandments are about God for a reason, right? Like, because rights come with responsibilities. If you have a right, you have a duty, right? So for example, you have the right to educate your kids. Why do you have the right to educate your kids? Because it's your duty to educate your kids. If you're going to be given a responsibility, then you naturally have a right to that thing. There's no such thing as animal rights, right? You might afford certain animals privileges, and like it's bad for you to torture animals because that's sinful, because that's weird. Okay, so maybe you might instantiate laws that, quote unquote, protect animals for reasons of, like I just explained, but they don't have a right because they don't have a responsibility. You have a right to work. Why? Because you have a duty to provide for your family, right? It all stems from your duties. God is in charge. God creates us. He sustains us. Therefore, ultimately, we're under he's responsible for us in a sense. Therefore, he has a right to be worshipped, right? Because it's his duty to sustain us. Anyway, so that's one thing people probably forget a lot today too. You hear us talk about rights. We have the Charter of Rights. For example, in Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's it's late in the game. It's 1980s, but it's like our Constitution. It's like our Bill of Rights or whatever. And but it's already wrong. Right off the bat, it's already wrong because it's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because it equates rights and freedoms as the same thing. That's not the same thing. It should be the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities. That would actually be a pretty good document. Because, for example, it has in there like freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly. Okay, but is a right the same thing as a freedom? Not necessarily, right? I have the freedom to swing my fist as I'm walking down the street because I have arms and I can make them move in any way I want. I don't have the right to swing them at your face if we're not in an altercation that requires self-defense, because it's not my duty to protect myself unless it is that time. So freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. Do you have the freedom sort of in the interior aspect? Yeah. I mean, like, you have your free will and you can decide what things you assent to, and that's going to have the consequences it's going to have. But do you have the right to all those things? Not if they get in the way of your duty to instantiate Christ as king. Right.
Right. And you just went into the Christian notion of religious liberty, the proper understanding of religious liberty, in the sense that the Jews were always a protected minority who were the idea of forcibly converting Jews was condemned by the church since the very beginning. And Jews were protected through especially from St. Gregory the Great, as a minority. And the conditions for their freedom were that Jesus is king of the society, the king, the queen in the kitchen. And the Jews are free to practice their religion in their own area.
Yep.
But they do not have, excuse me, they do not have the right to disrupt the sovereignty of Christ over the society. And that is the difference, because and this is the same thing when it goes for toleration with Protestants later, is that Jesus Christ is king, and he is the church. The Catholic Church is the mediating authority of the morals of society, both politically, economically, in the family. But if there are needs for a particular minority who has a different religion, they can be tolerated for the sake of the common good, as long as they do not upset the common good and upset the greater society. That is the real religious liberty. Now, if they do upset the society, and this is the situation that you have, especially with Mohammedans, because their religion does not have a concept of non-interference with the society, because the Quran and the Muhammad himself is a political, politics and religion are not separated in Mohammedanism at all. Right. It is, Sharia law is the religion, period.
Which in a way is, it's almost like an extreme. I don't know if the word's extreme. It's a proper principle taken to a illogical conclusion, I guess, because there's an aspect of that where we would think in a Christian society that your constitution would be a Christian constitution, but when it's based in a falsity, it creates a problem.
Yeah, they have. So what Christians have, they have the distinction between church and state without separation, distinction without separation, whereas Mohammedans have no distinction. There's one man who is the successor of the prophet, the caliph, who is both priest and king in their society. Right. And so there is no distinction in that sense. Whereas the Jews, they can live their life in their community, and they can not disrupt the rest of the society. But this is another story, but unfortunately that was disrupted by the Jews, Protestants, and Mohammedans in various different ways. And that's what causes and brings on the suppression by the civil authority because of Jesus Christ the King. So I wanted to quote one other thing, though, from Leo the 13th. We talked about the main principle is the non-separation of church and state, distinction without separation, the subordination of the temporal power to the spiritual power. The other aspect of that, I think, is that there are two spheres of influence as well, because the temporal power has its own sphere, the civil authority. The church does not tell the state that they need to have only this type of economic tax policy or only this type of border control. It simply gives the state certain principles. It can identify certain things that are black and white, like child murder and killing of the elderly and sick, aka euthanasia. It can say certain things that are black and white, but most things in politics beyond those black and white issues, the church simply gives these principles.
Well, that's one of the things. It's so annoying. It's kind of like, modernist, neo-modernist, whatever Catholics, they'll say, well, the church isn't ruled infallibly on that. It's like, it's yes and no, because there are the commandments, there are the moral dogmas, there's the various dogmas that we have to believe. So has the church said, for example, like evolution, I always talk about, has the church said evolution, anathema? Well, no, because for one, there's like 50 different ways to define it, but it doesn't have to say evolution, anathema. Why? For one, that definition is slippery, so that's a problem. But two, because there's a bunch of other dogmas that you just have to follow in general. So if at any time you get rid of those dogmas, you've got a problem. So the same thing with politics. The church doesn't say you have to have this political system or that political system. Well, of course not, because that's impossible in the sense that you could have infinite different types of political systems with little tweaks and things like that based on whatever historical context. But the church has said you have to have the integral good. The church has said Christ has to be king. So if you don't have those things, then it's the wrong system.
Yeah, there you go. So that's a great way of saying it. Here's a quote from Leo XIII. This is from Almeida in 1892. And so he's talking about the Third French Republic at a time when there's been a lot of different changes in the French nation over the past 100 years at this time. So he says this: various political governments have succeeded one another in France during the last century, each having its own distinctive form: the empire, the monarchy, and the republic. By giving one's self to abstractions, one could at length conclude which is the best of these forms considered in themselves. And in all truth, it may be affirmed that each of them is good, provided it leads straight to its end. That is to say, to the common good for which social authority is constituted. And finally, it may be added that, from a relative point of view, such and such a form of government may be preferable because of this, of being better adapted to the character and customs of such and such a nation.
Mm-hmm.
In this order of speculative ideas, Catholics, like all other citizens, are free to prefer one form of government to another precisely because no one of these social forms is, in itself, opposed to the principles of sound reason, nor the maxims of Christian doctrine. And he goes on to condemn the separation of church and state, that is when that government must be rejected, or that legislation. Because obviously he's saying here there's no particular form of government in terms of monarchy, aristocracy, republic. There's no form of government among those three that is inimical to Christianity per se. There are certain forms of government that are inimical, communism, for example. But even communism, you can transform that into just sort of an aristocracy. You know, I mean, what Leo XIII says is that we do not overthrow the government. That is not our goal. He talks about how he talks about the difference between obedience to the constituted power, which is provided by God, and disobedience to particular legislation of that power.
Yeah.
So he's saying he's condemning insurrection and bloody sedition, but he's saying that we need to submit to ourselves to the given authority, but that does not mean that we need to submit ourselves to a particular legislation. So he's saying we can change the legislation. We can change the government through civil means, and make it reflect those ends that we're talking about that are necessary. But we're not seeking to overthrow, seeking to cause dissension among brethren, which hurts the common good.
Yeah, and you can prudentially disobey certain laws that are not ordained towards God's law or the common good. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, if you live in a country with all tax systems are pretty messed up nowadays. But if you live in a country where, let's say, the tax is particularly egregious, okay, or there's a regime change, you have a moderate conservative-ish government who has relatively low taxes, and then you flip to a far left, whatever. We're going to raise your taxes by 10, 15% or whatever it is. Prudentially speaking, I'm not saying officially on the books do this or that. I'm just saying, if there was a way where you could find a way to keep more of your money because it's necessary for your state in life, your primary duties of providing for your family, and it would cause you great harm and so on and so forth, and it's going to go to an unjust government, you could prudentially find a way around that as long as you're not be prudential about it, basically is the point. That'd be an example of finding a way to disobey an unlawful command, but at the same time not cause scandal and so on and so forth. You could do it with drinking age. People, my mom's Italian. I had my first, not glass of wine, but my nonna would put little blip of wine in my water when I was 7 years old. We're talking a teaspoon. But that's a normal thing in the European family. You sit and you have a glass of wine when you're 15 with your family. Drinking age is 19 in Canada. Okay, but I'm in my home with my family. Ultimately, their authority supersedes that of the state in my home, especially. Whether or not the government says that is irrelevant because we know by the natural law that that's the case. So those are little prudential ways, I guess. But
yeah, Ripperger says that it is the duty of the parents by natural law to teach their children temperance. So they need to teach them how to drink alcohol long before 19.
You know what's hilarious? When I lived in Italy, I was there in grade 8. Okay. Things are different. So like, in North America, it's probably the same in the States. When you have a birthday party, you go to the person's house and they provide all the food and the pizza and the cake, and then you guys bring a present, right? In Italy, it's not like that way. And I actually found that out awkwardly at the first birthday I went to with my classmates. So in Italy, you don't bring a gift. You go to a pizzeria or something, and everyone just pays for their own meal. So the host doesn't have to pay for the meal. And then all you do is pitch in a few bucks for a gift. It's actually kind of a good system because the kid gets one gift because you don't need 15, 20 gifts. You can have as many friends as you want because they're paying for themselves. Anyway, so, but kids were drinking in grade 8. Like they were ordering pints and glasses of wine because there's no drinking age whatsoever in Italy. There's not even there's no drinking age at all. Now, a couple kids, I remember watching them. I'm like, that kid just got drunk. That was weird. I'd never seen that in a public place as a Canadian kid. However, by a young teenager. But most of the kids were 14 and they just ordered a beer and they just drank their beer with their pizza. And that was it. There was no binge drinking in Italy. There was obviously alcoholism and things, but this idea that, like this funneling and shots, like that kind of stuff. I went back when I was 18 to visit all my family and friends again. That people were partying, but they weren't binge drinking. They just didn't binge drink because it wasn't a novel thing to them. So it speaks to the temperance that you have from being exposed to it moderately.
Yeah, that's a very interesting subject for another show.
Yeah,
an issue in America. But Sean Sega Agas has a great question. Can communism be Catholicized in any way? And to which I will simply answer, only if it ceases to be communism. And by that I mean, in the reason the church says that Pius XI, Divini Redemptoris, says 1937, no Catholic can be a socialist, period. Mm-hmm. It cannot be, because the reason is because the very fundamental principles of communism, socialism, Marxism is inimical to Christ. Yeah. By the very principles of communism. So if you remove the principles, so if you have a communist regime, so for example, Russia, Soviet communism, you have a sort of mainly a bloodless revolution, at least especially in the Eastern Bloc of these different nations that basically democratically elected others than the Marxists. Even if the former communists, let's say the communists are converted, they're in power, they're converted to Christ. So then they stay in power and they just switch the form of government, or they simply acknowledge Christ, or they become a monarchy or whatever. They can become anything you want. As long as the people in power forsake the principles upon which communism is based. But communism itself, the principles of communism are denial of Christ, denial of the rights of the family, feminism. These things are all anti-Christ.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues that you find so frequently, like right now we have communism in Canada encroaching. It's nuts what's happening. But you talk to boomers, and I'm not just picking on the boomers, okay? But I talk to my parents and stuff. We don't have communism. What are you talking about? I still make my own money. It's like, it's not about your money. Ultimately, communism is about social control. It's about replacing God with the state and so on and so forth. China's still communist, even though there's a bunch of rich people, but they're rich in the way that the state decides it's okay to be rich and whatever. So I think people confuse, they look at communism as just financial system, which is an important part. But, for example, I was talking to my wife yesterday about Norway. Norway is a funny little country because people love to talk about Norway. Bernie Sanders, look at Norway, look at Sweden, But Norway has like 4 million people. It's got less people than the Greater Toronto Area, and it's a small country. It's ethnically homogenous, but it's also extremely wealthy. So a lot of people don't know this, but one of the reasons why Norway is quote unquote so socialist, it's not. It's extremely capitalist. And they made tons of money from offshore drilling in the 1980s and 90s, to the point where they decided as a nation, because you can do this with a small country where everyone believes and thinks and acts the same way, basically. They decided to put away a ton of money for everyone to have an epic retirement and so forth. Now, they're taxed out the wazoo, but almost everything they do for their leisure time and so forth is greatly subsidized. Now, I'm not saying go do that on an American scale or Canadian scale. I'm not even saying it's good, but I'm saying people would look at that and they would say that's communist. No, they're not communist there. They just decided as an ethnically homogenous and small population to do something where they all agreed upon and give up their money for what they perceive to be the public good. So in that case, you could have a sort of economically seeming socialist situation, but still make it very Catholic because they don't have any rules against being Catholic or whatever, right? It's not really communism, but they have sort of an economic equity, they might call it, based in a society where you have freedom of conscience and so forth. So people a lot of the time will confuse the accidental properties of communism, i.e. taxes and subsidizing things, with the actual heart of communism, which is the control of your mind and the rejection of God.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's an article I wrote called Catholic Economics for 1 Peter 5, where I distinguished that there was sort of this progressive Catholicism in America.
Yeah.
By Monsignor John Ryan, Sergeant Shriver. They believed in big government and using tax money to support things like the poor and the Peace Corps and that type of thing. So that's simply a prudential judgment in terms of the amount of taxing that you do and the amount of use that you do for the taxing, as long as you don't neglect subsidiarity.
Mm-hmm.
But subsidiarity also can be debated, because it's basically the argument that this higher authority has the duty to do this one thing. And so it's simply it's somewhat more debatable. Like in Norway, you're saying like, well, the bigger form of government is asserting that this is a greater good for the common good. And it may be, it may not, but it's somewhat debatable. So yeah, I think it's a really good point, because you can have a big government with large taxes, and it could actually be a good thing according to Catholic principles. But that's sort of a big government per se is not against Catholic principles.
Well, and it's a big, once again, I'm not advocating, like I'm not saying go be Norway. Like people are going, oh, he's so, I'm just saying it's something I've realized or I've noticed, but it's also, once again, it's a big government in a tiny nation. So it's still relatively small.
It's certainly, and that's the thing about subsidiarity. It definitely can work when you have a very small population, I think. And we're not saying, again, we're not saying Norway works, but it's just in theory. In theory, it can be in existence. But in communism, in theory, doesn't work, because the theory of communism is antichrist, period. But this gets into modern errors, I think. Because we talk about liberalism. Liberalism is so named because liber means freedom. It's all about freedom. That's the freedom and liberty is the watchword of the modern world that we live in. But the church has understood very early, that the popes have understood, that what they mean by liberty is really liberty from the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
that's really what they mean by
morality.
liberty.
Just morality.
They want freedom. They want freedom, but they want freedom from God. Now, I've been doing research from a book on this topic, and it seems to me that this really originates. It originates with the Protestant Revolt, but on a larger political scale, it really starts with the Dutch Revolt. The Dutch were revolting in the 1580s from Spanish rule. Now, Spanish rule was very brutal. They were brutalizing the population because they were revolting, and there was abuses. But as I read this in Russell Kirk, actually, he said correctly, I think, revolutionaries always take the discontent of the people and they take advantage of it. Yeah, that's what revolutionaries do. That's what the Protestants did. They take a real abuse, excuse me, they abuse it, and they cause a revolution. So the Dutch Revolt happens, which is where a bunch of Protestants and some Catholics revolt against Spanish rule. They create a Dutch Republic, 1580s and early 1600s. And there's a thinker that comes out of that, and later many other thinkers, where his name is Hugo Grotius, and he's the one who starts to stipulate that the union of man must be based on Adam and not on Christ. This is the phrase that Taylor Marshall used in his video. Shout out to Marshall. I thought it was a very good way to say it. The idea that we should advocate the unity of mankind based on Adam and not on Christ. And the idea is that natural law can be posited on, Aristotle. And this is what happens all the way. This is the same principle goes on all the way to John Courtney Murray when they're talking about separation of church and state in the 50s. Natural law does come from Aristotle and Plato and the Greek philosophers, who are pagans. They're pagan, but in a way that's pre-Christian. They're not anti-Christian because Christ has not come yet. So they cannot be anti-Christian. But when you talk about these philosophers that come out of the Protestant revolt, so first you have the Dutch Revolt, then you've got the English Civil War and the Cromwellian Revolt and the so-called Glorious Revolution, what I call the Ugly Revolution, 1688. John Locke. Their ideas of freedom are essentially freedom for all unless you're a Catholic, because what they want to do is they want to create a society that's based on the principle of unity is Adam and not the Catholic Church. The principle of unity is basically anything but Catholicism. We'll even tolerate Catholics sometimes if they're completely neutered Catholics who do not want to proclaim Jesus as king and subordinate the society to the Catholic Church in its principles. We want to suppress everything that's Catholic. So this idea of the natural law being, and Hugo Grotius is interesting because he's early 1600s. He posits that even if God were not to exist, you could still have a union of minds by the rational nature of humankind. People have rational natures, which is rational nature is correct, but the problem is that leads to the assertion that we need to construct society in a way where we exclude God. And that it's basically a secular or atheistic idea of natural law. But the problem with that is natural law has religion as a fundamental part of natural law. Every single society has had a religious structure, period. There's never been a secular society until after the Protestant Revolt, the Dutch and the English, and later the American Revolution. So if you want to have a principle of natural law, you have to have a public cultus of divinity. That's natural law. And so when you try to assert that we should have a secular natural law, it leads straight to atheism. And that's the trajectory of, so then you have what I see is Martin Luther had the so-called magisterial reformation, and then you had the radical reformation, which is when Luther started his reformation and he was happy with it. But then all these peasants started revolting and they started practicing polygamy and going crazy. And he said, okay, princes, we've gone too far, suppress them. And this is what I see as analogous to what we call the right liberals and the left liberals. You have the right liberals who are typified in Edmund Burke, who condemns the French Revolution, but he is sort of a right liberal because he wants the whole liberal society. He wants the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom from Catholicism. Basically, he wants
Catholic?
that.
Was Burke Catholic?
Edmund Burke.
Yeah, or was he like an Anglican?
I thought he was a High Anglican.
Okay, that's what I thought too. I'm just wondering. Yeah.
I don't understand. I'll look it up, but basically, he starts the conservative tradition because he condemns the French Revolution. The French Revolution is basically the left liberals. So they go crazy. They've got pornography in their society that's allowed in the free speech, whereas pornography, to their credit, is not allowed in the British and the Americans until much later. But it's allowed very early in the French. And so you have the conservative tradition in the liberals, which are basically right liberals. They want to sustain, or they want to continue the liberal tradition without going too far.
Well,
They're
it's
right.
honestly, it's conservatism is liberalism on slow drip. I always say, like, what are you conserving? Well, you're conserving, I don't know, you're conserving these vestige of morals from Christendom, I guess, which is why conservatives always get, when people think of conservatives, they think of Christians, because there's some truth to that, and I get that. But what are you conserving? What's it based on? I mean, if you're conserving these liberal principles, which essentially is what they are in a lot of cases, sure, it's a more desirable society to live in, is a conservative society in today's world than a leftist society, sure. But there is ultimately no basis for conserving those necessary principles if you try to do so just by the state, because trying to do so just by the state is in and of itself a liberal principle.
Okay, I just clarify. So Burke his mother was Catholic, but he adhered to Anglicanism throughout his life, unlike his sister, who remained a Roman Catholic. So he was certainly, and he was pro Catholic emancipation and everything. But
that's what I thought.
He was one of those much more rational Anglicans that you get from time to time. Yeah, so there is the right liberal, especially they want the liberal system on the when we talk king, queen, and kitchen. They want the Catholic system in the kitchen. They want the Catholic family life, the Catholic sexual morals. They want those Catholic things, but they don't want Catholic economics, and they don't want Catholic government. They don't want those things. Now, the left liberals, they want king, coin, and kitchen all free from the Catholic Church. Yeah. They want total freedom from the Catholic Church. And so, I mean, that's what I see as the difference. Now, we really want to make a strong distinction between the people who advocate republicanism, mm-hmm. who are fully Catholic. Now, there's a difference there, yeah. Because, and this is according to Dietrich von Hildebrand, who's my favorite 20th century writer, probably, he says that so going back to 1892, the encyclical I quoted earlier, this is when the Third Republic is happening in France. Leo XIII says, obey the government, don't try to overthrow it, and basically implies that they should work with the Third Republic, they should work to Christianize it. And this is what causes the movement of Le Sillon to be founded by Marc Sangnier. Now, Dietrich von Hildebrand says Marc Sangnier was 100% Orthodox. He was his friend, totally Orthodox Catholic, and he essentially created a Christian Republican movement attempting to Christianize the Republic, not trying to advocate monarchy. We've talked about Action Française, and that is his rival. It was Marat, who critiques Sangnier. But Sangnier, unlike Marat, was a Catholic, was a pious Catholic, and but Leo XIII says that we can advocate either of the two. But Sangnier creates a movement which I would not call, according to what I can tell from Le Sillon, I would not call right liberal. Now, later on, there are what von Hildebrand says, there are imprudent gestures or words said by some of the leaders, which ends up getting it condemned, like Action Française gets condemned later. Yeah. Because there are liberal principles that get repeated by some of their members. But in terms of Marc Sangnier, he was never condemned personally for his views. After Le Sillon was condemned by Pius X, he started a new organization which was also advocating republicanism, which was not specifically Catholic, but it was still working to Christianize the Republican society. So I think there is a distinction between a right liberal and a Catholic Republican who can truly seek to Christianize the whole of society, of this Republican society, without adopting the liberal principles. What are your thoughts on that, Kennedy?
Yeah. There's a lot of, we should make some distinctions too. Sometimes they'll say, well, they'll exalt, let's say, monarchy, or they'll exalt a republican form of government. Both of those can be corrupted. The Republicanos in Spain, They were Republicans, technically speaking, kind of, but they were socialists. Okay, those are the ones that in the early 1930s totally suppressed the church in Spain and things like that. But they had this idea of basically a French revolutionary type republic thing. And then at the same time, obviously, you have some monarchies that, the Protestant error of how monarchy works with this divine right of kings and so on and so forth, that totally basically turns it into a totalitarian dictatorship. Okay, that's what most Americans think about when they have this mythology of what a monarchy is, because King George III was nothing like most of the myths say he was, but nonetheless, it was a Protestant approach to monarchy. So anyway, but when we talk about, if you actually think of the ideal Catholic government, whether it's a monarchy or whether it's a republic, it's going to have a mixed regime. In the Catholic societies where monarchy was actually well functioning, it was never an absolutist. You always had the monarch who had a very limited sphere of power, usually concerned with matters of national religion, national sovereignty, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. And stability. I mean, he was a symbol almost in a lot of ways of stability. Okay. And everyone loves elections. Doesn't it get tiring having a cultural revolution every 4 years? I mean, it's not sustainable. It'd be nice if we didn't have to vote for a new person every year to break their promises. And then you had the aristoi, the aristocracy, which it sounds like a bad word to a lot of people. It properly understood, it just means noblemen in society who have earned their influence. I mean, you could be a business person, you could be an educator, you could be a military person, whatever, but you're somebody who's worth listening to or worth making decisions. This is absurd about democracy, is that people advocate for people under the age of 18 to vote or something. You're a moron until you're like 30 years old. I mean, and even then you're still kind of partly a moron. I mean, Charles Coulomb was one of my favorite thinkers. I talk about him all the time. I would rather have like 100 Charles Coulombs, if there is such a number of such unique people. But if you could have 100 guys like that making decisions for an entire state, would be better than 50,000 idiots making their own decisions and not knowing it up from down. Not everyone's vote should be worth the same in the sense that we think about it, because most people don't know what they're talking about when it comes to economics or when it comes to moral policies and so forth. So that's where the aristocracy comes in. It's basically like fathers of families and clans and things, knowing from their lived experience and understanding the morality of their society, what decisions should be made. And then on less essential issues, on like things that just have to do with your town or village, you would have a polity, which is what we really think of as democracy, is this idea that everyone has a say. But everyone can only have a say in things that are, in a way, like non-essential. Are we going to have a street light downtown? Everybody can have a say in that, because it's not something one way or the other that affects your salvation. It's like, well, I don't want it in front of my shop. Well, you can do that. So in an ideal Catholic society, you've always had a mixed regime where each level of power had a sphere of influence that was proper to that level, and they really leave each other alone a lot. It's when you have and I'm reading right now through Michael Davies Cranmer's Godly Order. Man, just as a side note, I had never read much of Luther or the Reformers. Oh my goodness, they were insane. They were insane. It's just like, are you drunk when you're writing that? But in any case, he talks about how the monarchy changes a lot in England when the religion changes. And it does. It goes from a very mixed regime, subsidiarity-based Catholic monarchy, imperfect, but nonetheless better than what we have now, to a divine right of kings, put your boot on the neck if people don't do what you want them to do, and install this, that, and the other thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is why I cannot be convinced by right liberals, is that historically, like you just mentioned, Henry VIII takes all the land and the property from the poor in the church, takes it to himself, gives it to his friends and his buddies. This is what happens in every Protestant country. This is why the Protestants happen, because the rich and the elite find a way to get more power out of it.
Yeah.
And then liberalism, and what you have is Whig history. Whig history and liberalism is a way to justify and rationalize this theft, this sin against the Ten Commandments. because as a Whig history is a way to justify the status quo, to say that we are progressing on this evolutionary course of liberty.
Yes.
And this is something that's adopted by one of the foremost proponents of liberalism in the 19th century, Lord Acton.
Yep.
And I'm just remain unconvinced, because it seems to be a complete rationalization of the Protestant revolt and the theft of church property.
Well, it's accepted by the Second Vatican Council. Which is this document? Modern man is becoming more increasingly aware of his dignity. It's like, that's
Right.
nonsense. This is the worst century in human history as far as immoral bloodshed is concerned. What are you even talking about?
Yeah, that I mean, Ratzinger says that Vatican II was shot through with Teilhard de Chardin, who was, I mean, because first you have liberal Whig history, then you have the continuation of, we have evolution, which sort of makes a justification of Whig history on a very evolutionary basis.
Yeah.
And then you have Teilhard de Chardin, who puts everything in a spiritual light, and that's what influences the fathers of the Second Vatican Council. So they fail to see they don't fail to see, they actually suppress the warnings of Fatima and Ottaviani and these other fathers who are saying, no, don't do it. This is going to be a disaster. Anyhow, so this brings us to a few important questions. TRN/ says, because America was founded on liberalism, does this mean that the progression of America is geared towards anti-logos? How can Catholics reverse this? Is it possible? I mean, I think that with Leo XIII saying that Catholics should work with the French Republic, French Republic, I do not think, and the church accepting republicanism as such, I do not think that it's a foregone conclusion to say America, or really any Republican nation, democratic nation, needs to be overturned. It's certainly not per se inimical to the Christian church. And for a while, at least, especially in America, American history was, I mean, the constitutional arrangement from 1789, I would say, was quite good. And Leo XIII says that in Longiqua in 1891, I believe. It's quite good until the 14th Amendment is when it gets really bad, after 1865, I believe. So I don't think that but even then, I don't think it's per se inimical, because we're just talking about legislation. Like Leo XIII says, you can oppose the legislation, you can change legislation, you can amend the Constitution. The National Reform Association of Protestants wanted to amend the Constitution of the United States and add Christ the King in it.
It's good.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So I do not think that we need to try to necessarily, I mean, it depends on your particular circumstance. And this is another show that we're planning to do someday, is what do we do? Do we secede the Union? Do we become Amish? Do we try to Christianize the Republic? I think all those options are legitimate. I think Catholics can do all of those things. It depends on your particular situation. So I don't think that it's necessary. What do you think, Kennedy?
Yeah, I agree. Seemingly unrelated, but did an episode on Halloween the other day for my Fatima Center show. And the priest I was talking to, he was addressing the idea, like, what would you do? Because I should back up. The thing about the American constitutional ideas is they, in a way, tried to, I mean, yes, it was Freemasonic sort of, but at the same time, they tried to create like a new Rome. This is why they have this is why you go to Washington. I've only seen pictures, but there's so much Roman imagery there. And there's this, and you hear about it in their writings, almost like they're going to create a new republic like Rome, and so there's a lot of natural law in there. There really is. They might not have a vocabulary for it, but there is a lot of natural law. There is a lot of subsidiarity. Really, the idea, especially compared to today's world, the idea of having an antebellum South or whatever, where, you would have states basically acting as their own countries, and they could have their own state churches if they want, and whatever. That sounds like paradise compared to now, So there is a lot of good there, because a lot of it's, whether they know it or not, is based in natural law principles. So that's fine. So with regards to what I was saying about my video, is the priest I was talking to was talking about mythology, Halloween, old pagan festivals, and that. He talked about St. Basil the Great, who would talk about, is it St. Basil the Great? I think so, right? He would talk about, what's it called? Like old Greek myths and things like that. Can a Catholic read those, for example? And he said, yes. Do not make them the anchor of your mind, but take from them what is good and reject what is bad. Fair enough. So in a society, I mean, do not make the Constitution the anchor of your mind, which so many people do. It's not a divinely inspired document, but let's just say it's 80% good. Great. Take 80% of it and reject what is bad. So the same principle applies.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, definitely, yeah, I think some people do make the Constitution the anchor of their mind. They do believe in what Abraham Lincoln said, that this nation will not perish from the earth. Well, that's not true. That's blasphemous. And eventually America will fall. I mean, it's just everyday paltry, earthly nation will eventually fall.
Yes.
So we shouldn't try to think those thoughts, but we're trying to preserve what we have. We're trying to seek the common good. The dissolution of government is generally always bad for everybody. So here's a great question. Marie Morrison says, any comment on the current political situation in Poland? Now, I have not studied Poland very extensively, but what I can tell from Poland as well as Hungary in Europe, they are, especially in Hungary, there's sort of a coalition of Protestants. Their president's Protestant, but they have a strong Protestant Catholic coalition against the Marxists and the modernists. And the same is in Poland. There is a strong Catholic, obviously the Catholic history of Poland, and this is a great example of Christian democracy, I think, in Poland, because it was a bloodless revolution against the Marxists inspired by John Paul II, which happened in other states as well. But I think Poland, I know that there are all these states, any state that tries to have basic Christ the King, even if it's with Protestants, against the Marxists, is going to come under attack by the globalists. And the Poles are under attack. Their last election, to my knowledge, was very close. It was at least too close for comfort, basically. But they retained the president who was retaining those traditional values.
Duda, yeah.
Right. So, maybe you have more comments on this, but I think that if there is any model for Christian democracy, Christian involvement in this secular Republican world, I think the models come from Poland or Hungary. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about Brazil and Trump as well. But I think that sort of populist, which I view as simply subsidiarity, the nationalist, subsidiarity, just considering your own nation first. But I think that Poland is the model. What do you think?
Yeah, we need Cesare the Pole to chime in from Twitter. But yes, but this is how I look at it, because a lot of things about Poland are really great, but we think of Poland as like this extremely Catholic country, but their mass attendance is about 35%. So it's not. That being said, it's kind of like Portugal in that sense, where I grew up around a lot of Portuguese guys, and like it could be that dad never goes to church, but dad will slap you if you take the Lord's name in vain. Mm-hmm. Like I'm not saying he shouldn't go, but you know what I'm saying? He's Catholic.
Catholic culture.
Yeah, but really Catholic. Like it's Catholic in his bones, and it's not just like Catholic culture where you get First Communion parties because that's fun. It's bigger than that. Poland probably is like that. So, I mean, there's a billboard I saw on Twitter the other day in Poland where people have got a billboard with someone has dirty palms and they're holding the Eucharist, and the Eucharist is bleeding, and it was like no to communion in the hand. I mean, they have a social movement. So that's, right. I mean, that's definitely more. It's not just more. It's 10-15% more mass attendance, but it's more than that, because it's like the air they breathe there. That being said, everywhere right now, because our leadership from Rome and our bishops, Poland has some better bishops, but nonetheless, it's still so weak. I mean, relative to think of the great ages of faith. I mean, even in America, what was the bishop from New York? Was it John Hughes?
John Hughes, yeah.
I mean, Charles Coulomb has this. He talks about him going to the mayor and saying, like, we're going to burn your city down if you don't protect our churches. That's amazing. I mean, like, I can't imagine what it would be like for a bishop to do that. I mean, bishops won't even keep their churches over for the seasonal flu nowadays. But we have a bishop saying, like, I'll burn your city down if one hair of the head of one of my Catholics gets touched by your know nothing party people. So we don't have that today, though, at all. We don't have that. Even in countries that are decent, like Poland, the bishops talk a real good game. They'll come out against the things that are really anti-marriage and so forth. but they're still saying everybody put a diaper on your face no matter what when you go to church. So right now, it's like we have a lot of real, faithful, strong sons of the church, lay people who are of goodwill, but they're trying to do this without a father. And because of that, the enemy's getting in the home. I saw a picture of on Twitter of a cathedral, and there's probably like 50 Catholic men, 50 to 100 Catholic men standing on the stairs outside, really big set of stairs, and there's like 4,000 or 5,000 revolutionaries facing them down who want to burn the church down. That's insane. The army should be there. Well, first of all, those revolutionaries shouldn't even get that close in the first place. But the point is that's the situation we're in, where everyone wants time of the laity. The time of the laity is a dark time, because it's really like the time of the laity is a chastisement. It's not a good thing. It's good that we have lay involvement, but if we don't have the spiritual headship and the civil headship of our Catholic leaders in the church and in the state, then we're going to have a major issue. So Poland, yeah, is it a better example? Sure. But ultimately without the leadership of the church, it's going to be a real problem.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it goes back to the Vatican II policy change, which is essentially we want to work with the secular republic, and Paul VI basically accepts the idea of Hugo Grotius and says the UN is the obligatory path forward for peace. We have to have this secular union of nations, and we're no longer going to advocate Jesus is king, and that nations must be subordinate to Christ. And so the bishops are following that program. And so this is the situation that we're in, which brings us to Catholic Ben Shapiro says, should more Catholics participate in politics? I think this is a good closing question to answer. I think this is the difficulty, because when lay Catholics are the only ones defending the churches, this is sort of a picture of what Catholic politicians have to deal with, because Catholic politicians may have to advocate the death penalty, for example, against Pope Francis, knowing the doctrine of the church. And Catholics may, some bishops may even, like John Courtney Murray did, advocate the error of the separation of church and state. John F. Kennedy did that as a Catholic. We've got Joe Biden. He's a Catholic.
Yeah.
So
Justin Trudeau is a Catholic.
Oh, there we go. So should more Catholics be in politics? I guess at face value, yes, absolutely. We need true Catholics in political arena. What do you think, Kennedy?
I'm conflicted, because politics is so disgusting nowadays. So, there's a new party in Ontario opening up called the New Blue. In Canada, blue is conservative. Okay, and actually, it was in the States, blue was conservative until they wanted to tar the Republicans red to give you this association with communism. But in the world over, blue is associated with conservatism for whatever reason. So the Conservative Party here in Ontario is a total mess. It's a disaster. I mean, our Premier Doug Ford is a total loser. He turned into a total socialist, and he's destroying businesses. He's supposed to be this conservative. Anyway, so a lot of people are defecting from the party, and they're starting a new one called the New Blue. I was talking with somebody the other day, and they were like, Kennedy, you should run, unironically. And I thought about it, and then I thought, man, politics is so disgusting nowadays, especially against social conservatives. I would never want to put my children in a situation where, listen, we've all got skeletons in the closet, I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine if, so-and-so that I used to know 20 years ago came out and said, that sort of thing. And we all have those issues, okay? It's, the system is so rotten that can a Catholic be a part of it? Yeah, but I would almost advocate it would depend on your state in life. We almost need like celibate men with no families to go into politics. Seriously. Yeah. Or old retired men or something like that, because it's so corrupt. I mean, I don't know how you would, for example, in Ontario, and especially in the national level, I don't know how you could walk into a parliamentary session and have to make a decision. Like, I mean, I don't know how you could vote for 90% of the stuff they put forth, even from the Conservative Party, because it's all liberal. I don't know how you could participate without compromising your without compromising the dogmas, in a way that you're going to get reelected. Because if you're not going to go along, you're not going to get reelected. So it's almost a futile attempt. I don't mean to be fatalist about it, because I do think that politics is important, but I don't know how you do it. And this is why, you know, my fellow traditionalists who get a little bit pessimistic about Donald Trump and stuff, there's an aspect of Donald Trump that's very providential in that he's not a Catholic, which is almost a good thing in a sense. Hear me out here. Just like Constantine. Everyone needs to read Brian McCall's most recent article in Catholic Family News. I read it the other day. We have this of Constantine because he did liberate the church in a sense. We think that he must have been a saint. When you actually look at the life of Constantine, just like every other pagan emperor, he was a total, to our standards as faithful Catholics, he was a total moral degenerate. I mean, all he really did was make the state tolerate Christianity, which eventually led to its instantiation of the church, the state religion. But he didn't give it rights initially above all other churches or religions. After he had his sort of interior conversion, he still attended and oversaw various pagan rituals. He had a sordid personal life with multiple marriages and things. He probably had mistresses and a harem and things like that, like all these emperors did. He was a total moral degenerate. You know, what Constantine did, for example, it was a lot like Donald Trump in that he allowed people to champion their freedoms as Christians, at least theoretically, but was still a total religious indifferentist and not a holistic, theologically sound Catholic. So what's the point of that? Well, someone like Donald Trump, someone like Constantine, they're already living in a state of mortal sin. They're already working within a consequentialist moral framework, which is a pagan moral framework. So it would be impossible for a Catholic today to go and be the president of the United States and actually remain Catholic. It'd be impossible because it's just too corrupt. You would not get reelected, so on and so forth. So it's interesting how it seems that at times in history, God uses certain leaders who wildly imperfect, but because of their positions work to facilitate the championing of Christ the King. So I don't know. I think that's a little bit of a tangent, but so can a Catholic get involved in politics? I think at this point, if you're not a celibate man and, you know, that sort of thing, you really should pray really hard for it because that's about as close as you can get.
Yeah, I think this eventually we'll get into another show about the options for Catholics in this secular world, Marxist world. Yeah, because I do agree with you that it is rotten. And it's very difficult, near impossible to be a Catholic politician. You'd certainly be hated and driven from power as much as possible by the Marxists if you were upfront about.
They try to ruin your life, and they ruin your family's life,
and ruin your life and your family.
Yeah.
So you certainly need to look at your stated life and your duties to your children if you were to embark on such a quest for the common good. So it's a very difficult, certainly difficult decision, and something that each man's conscience needs to be the deciding factor. We can't pass judgment on Catholics who decide to get into politics or interact with this Republican or become, create their own Catholic colony or secede from the Union, whatever.
I should say, if Ryan Grant watches this, he's going to be annoyed because what we should be doing is the distinction. Getting involved in local politics is actually probably a really good idea. So because
good point.
Like, you know, your town, your county, whatever, stuff that has to do with the general goings on of your day-to-day life, you can totally do that and maintain your Catholic principles. And that hopefully would create an environment where you have a grassroots movement of like a true common good that you could probably do without having to make everything about religion. I mean, there's lots of ways you can do that at the local level. So yes, I would say that. Do that.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great way. We'll continue to talk more. We've got the United States election happens next week, so we'll probably.
What is Rome going to do this year?
Yeah, well, the alleged winner we may have the alleged winner of the election next week, but I say alleged because we know that the election will most likely be contested in the courts or in the streets. And so there may be bloodshed. We need to protect our families and be aware of what's going to go on. So
at least you don't have a king, though.
Yeah, at least we don't have a king. True. Very, very
so much
important.
better.
Tyrants. So let's offer up our Father for the United States election. Pray for all our brethren throughout the world. Jesus is King. Viva Cristo Rey. To all Catholic brethren, especially our European brethren watching this early morning show over here in North America. It's early in the morning, but in Europe, it's afternoon.
Lunchtime.
Yeah. So shout out to all our brethren. Viva Cristo Rey. Let's offer up an Our Father for the common good of all of our nations, every nation that we reside, that Christ the King may be sovereign for the greater glory of God and the salvation of souls. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in caeli, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitti nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti.